Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for coming to this launch event for the BBC Charter Review Alternative Green Paper. My name's Lee Edwards. I'm the chair of the Media Reform Coalition, and I'm also a professor of strategic communications and public engagement at the London School of Economics and Political Science. The Media Reform Coalition has been coordinating the Alternative Green Paper, and I'll be chairing today's event. The current review of the BBC's Royal Charter is a once-in-a-generation opportunity for the British public to debate and decide the future of the BBC. The public consultation about the new charter should then be an exercise in democratic engagement rather than simply information gathering. However, as those of you who've looked at the government Green Paper will know, the current consultation falls short in many respects, and it limits rather than facilitates public involvement with decisions about the BBC's future. So in response, the Alternative Green Paper was designed as a collaborative project to put the public at the centre of BBC Charter Review. It's a collection of ideas for reforming the BBC, featuring contributions from media experts, audience groups, campaign organisations and individual members of the public. The ideas are concisely expressed, just 2 pages, in straightforward language, and offer open questions for the public to respond to. Perhaps most importantly, they illustrate the imagination and innovation that the public and civil society want to share with the government about the future of our most important public service broadcaster. So today we're introducing the Alternative Green Paper to you all, and we'll put the link to the document in the chat in case you didn't receive it earlier today. And we're delighted that very shortly Clive Lewis MP will be introducing the event more formally. Clive is Labour MP for Norwich South, a former BBC reporter and technician, and a long-standing and passionate champion of the public interest in media reform, and we're delighted. Following Clive, we'll hear 10 contributors to the Alternative Green Paper, each briefly introducing their proposals. They have a strict 3-minute time limit, after which we will open up the event for discussion. And we invite as many of you as possible to participate in that discussion. We've purposely set this event up as a Zoom meeting rather than a webinar to help facilitate that interaction. And I'll talk a bit more about how we're going to make that happen following the speakers. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Clive.
Thank you very much for that. I appreciate that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. I recognise quite a few of the faces I'm seeing on my screen anyway. I'm not sure what everyone else is seeing, from those who came into Parliament a few weeks ago and I think delivered a very convincing explanation of where the government's white paper had gone, shall we say, slightly askew, possibly wrong, and what needed to happen. And I think what we're going to hear today is, in effect, the taking forward much of what we heard that day. I only wish there were more MPs who had turned up that day. I think that there is at the moment a distinct lack of engagement from many inside Parliament. We could perhaps go into the reasons for that. I know what I think myself, but I won't go into that here. But there is a distinct lack of engagement and interest from politicians who I think underestimate the importance that the BBC and our media ecosystem have to our democracy and so many of the issues that now confronts us. So, I mean, can I first of all begin by saying how relieved I am that the Media Reform Coalition exists. It came onto my radar back in the heady days of Corbynism, when I was but a mere new entrant to Parliament, and myself and some others, some of whom aren't around sadly anymore, they're still alive, but they're not in Parliament. I remember attending one of those first conferences. I'm relieved because also the scale of the problems confronting us is enormous. They're structural, they're systemic, and they're accelerating. We're living through a period in which institutions that once anchored our democracy are visibly fraying. Political parties, including my own, it's been a very bad week for us in Gorton and Denton, are struggling to command trust. Trade unions face new pressures in a fragmented economy. Public bodies are hollowed out and politicised. And now the BBC itself stands at a crossroads under sustained assault. The Charter Review should have been a moment of renewal, democratic renewal, once in a generation renewal, an opportunity to ask fundamental questions about what public service broadcasting is for in the 21st century. Instead, we've been offered in the government's white paper something which I think is frankly tinkering. And tinkering does not meet the moment. And that's why you're here, to try to up the game of the government. That's why I think what you do today, the discussions you have, where you take this forward, are going to be so critical in helping shape the public narrative on this issue. Because the crisis facing the BBC is not merely financial. It is not merely about governance structures, as important as they are. It's not merely about how the license fee is collected or replaced. It's also about legitimacy. And the BBC sits at that intersection of three different ecosystems: politics, culture, and the economy. It shapes public discourse, it sustains creative industries, it provides shared reference points in an age of fragmentation. And when it works well, it underpins democratic life itself. That makes it powerful, and that makes it a target. We know the threats to democracy today are not abstract. Authoritarian politics are rising across the world. Hybrid warfare and disinformation are no longer fringe concerns. They are central features of geopolitical strategy. We've seen how foreign actors manipulate social media, exploit grievance, and amplify division. We know too that the United States' own strategic thinking now openly speaks of pursuing pro-nativist agendas in Europe. At the same time, Silicon Valley billionaires, from Elon Musk to many others, are intervening directly in political and cultural discourse here in the UK. They own platforms, they shape algorithms, they radicalize conversations. So it's against that backdrop that the BBC cannot be treated as just another broadcaster. It's one of the few institutions with the reach, the credibility, and the scale to act as a bulwark against disinformation and democratic erosion. But only if it's independent, only if it's properly funded, only if it's governed in a way that reflects the public, not the government of the day. And that requires structural thinking. We can't separate media reform from democratic reform, nor can we separate it from political economy. In our wider economy concentrates wealth and power in fewer and fewer hands. If our democracy feels distant and unresponsive, then trust drains away from Parliament, from parties, from regulators, and yes, from the BBC. And that's what we're seeing. So restoring trust will not come from cosmetic adjustments. It will come from putting people at the heart of our institutions again. That means rethinking funding models so that public service broadcasting is stable and insulated from political leverage. It means embedding genuine democratic accountability in governance, and it means ensuring regional representation is real, not symbolic. And it means recognizing the BBC as part of a broader civic infrastructure alongside local journalism, community media, and cultural institutions. And it means being honest that the white paper as it stands simply is not up to the task. This is not the time for managerial tweaks. It's a time for democratic renewal. The Media Reform Coalition understands that. That is why your work matters. It broadens the debate beyond the narrow confines of what government is prepared to contemplate. It reminds us that the media reform is not technocratic housekeeping. It's about power, about who sets the term of public debate, about who gets heard. If we want a resilient democracy capable of withstanding oligarchic pressure at home and authoritarian influence abroad, then we need institutions that are structurally robust, publicly rooted, and democratically governed. The BBC can be part of that renewal, but only if we are bold enough to move beyond tinkering and brave enough to reimagine the settlement itself. And that's what your conference today is all about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Clive. Some great thoughts there that set the scene perfectly for the discussion today. And indeed, this connection of politics, culture and economy is exactly what the ideas in the AGP revolve around. And the idea of centering democratic governance and to create a robust institution is at the heart of many of the proposals that we see. So thanks again, Clive. Let's move then to our contributors. And we're going to we're going to have these people speaking in the order in which they appear in the document. So if you have the document with you, you'll be able to track their contributions. And I'd like to first invite Dan Hind to talk about BBC as a public service cooperative. Dan, over to you.
Thanks so much. I've got strictly 3 minutes, so I'm going to make it very brisk. I'm going to try and fit in a poem. So this is the idea of moving beyond tinkering, as Clive just said, and reconstituting the BBC as a cooperative institution. The BBC was constituted as a chartered corporation in December 1926. It will be 100 years as a chartered corporation this December. And I think 100 years is just about enough to have our public media organised as a chartered corporation, which, bear in mind, is the same institutional form as the East India Company. We recommend reconstituting the BBC as a public service cooperative in December 2027, and it will begin operations as such in January 2028. So we don't have long. The new charter essentially will be a cooperative charter. Now, a cooperative is run for the benefit of its members, and its members are actively and directly involved in both its governance and its operations. We propose that everyone who pays for this cooperative BBC will be a member of the BBC, and membership will confer new rights that are sufficient to secure active and direct participation in the BBC. This doesn't just mean voting. In particular, we think it needs two rights. First, the right to allocate a fraction of the BBC's budget to journalistic, educational and cultural projects of which we approve as individuals. And second, the right to sit on randomly selected panels, which will be integrated into the operations and governance of the BBC. These panels will be paid, and they will be engaged in a structured dialogue with the BBC's permanent employees, with politicians, with experts, academics, and with the public, crucially with the public broadly defined. So here's the poem that I promised you. Broad and shallow, deep and narrow, right? So this broad and shallow power means that we'll have some small amount of individual power over the media space, and that we can exercise quite casually, right? It's a bit like subscribing to something on Patreon. It doesn't take a lot of time or thought, and it doesn't really matter hugely what any individual one of us does with that little bit of the BBC's budget. But the sum total of our decisions is going to be crucially important, because it becomes a moving picture of our collective curiosity, our collective appetite for transformation, for new information, for connection. And the deep and narrow power means that some of us, chosen at random, not because we're rich or highly educated or privileged or desperate to be important, some of us will have a power that reaches deep into the means through which we understand the world, each other, and ourselves. And again, crucially, as members of those panels, we'll be engaged in a dialogue with all the other members of the BBC. Right? So we start to have a national conversation which is governed and informed by the interests and appetites of all of us rather than of a select elite. I cannot stress how tightly controlled things like editorial commissioning decisions are. So these new powers, I think, will transform the BBC. It means that high status but politically vulnerable employees at the BBC will no longer have a monopoly on commissioning decisions. Their professional skills and knowledge will be supplemented by bodies that can meaningfully stand in for the membership as a whole. Politicians will no longer be able to bully the BBC behind closed doors. Right? The relationship with government will take place in plain view. And all of us as members will have insight into the production and reproduction of our society's common sense. Right? If we want to understand the core of what it is to be powerful, it's to have insight into that process. Right? So we're talking about democracy. That's the heart of it. Is to understand how our common sense is being created and recreated. Now we have a year or slightly more to refine the details. I'm not saying that we should, crucially, it must stay in the public sector. I'm not saying that anything other than it remains a public sector institution, but it is a public sector institution built on cooperative values. And the principle is clear. We rely on public media. We all pay for it. and we must all take our place as its owners and operators. How close to 3 minutes is that, Lee?
That was slightly over, but that's fine.
Okay, I was going to just do the poem again if I got to.
Oh,
Thank you
we'll
very
leave it
much.
there.
Thank you for thank you for letting me explain that.
No problem. Thanks very much, Dan. Great to have that included. And I'm now going to move to Pip Eldridge for the Public Media Commission.
Just unmuting myself. Hi, I'm from the Voice of the Listener and the Viewer, and we're a charity that represents the interests of audiences to make sure that we all continue to benefit from high quality TV and radio across the UK. So we have a vision of creating a public media commission, and this vision is to enable a BBC that is stronger, more trusted, and genuinely accountable to the public it serves. And it will prevent crucial decisions about the BBC's future being made behind closed doors. The BBC is unlike any other media organisation in the UK. It's publicly owned, publicly funded, guided by a public mission, and free at the point of use. That unique combination makes it one of the most important institutions in our national life. But one of the big issues facing the BBC is the perception that it lacks independence from government, which then risks reducing public engagement and erodes consent for its continued public funding. Furthermore, the seeming willingness of governments to cut the BBC's licence fee funding makes the BBC institutionally cautious, when it should have the confidence to take risks, make bold choices, and trust its programme makers with the editorial and creative autonomy needed to make high-quality, innovative, and important programming. This Public Media Commission would determine and recommend the level of public funding for the BBC, including any future replacement for the licence fee. It would publish its recommendations openly, ensuring transparency. It would rigorously assess how well the BBC is fulfilling its public mission and use these to inform funding recommendations and decisions. It would also apply the public interest test, not only when new services are launched, but also when existing ones are closed. It would oversee independent, transparent appointments to key leadership roles, free from day-to-day political control. We're not talking about a new behemoth organisation, but a small, lean one that is fleet of foot, enabling decisions to be made quickly. We believe that the people who pay for the BBC should have confidence that decisions about its funding and governance are fair, transparent and accountable. We've seen what happens when they're not, like the 2015 funding settlement imposed after secret negotiations. A public media commission would really assist with renewing public trust. It's about strengthening democratic legitimacy. And most importantly, it's about ensuring that the BBC remains a truly public broadcaster, protected from political pressure and shaped by the citizens that it exists to serve. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Pip. That was great. Let's turn now to Samir Padania from Demos on the public lock.
Thanks, Lee. So I'm here speaking as a fellow of Demos, the think tank, as part of a broader set of proposals that we put out in a paper called Our BBC. And this is part of a broader reform picture that, overlaps with some of the things that colleagues are talking about, will talk about. And this particular element is one that's focused on a process that has moved from being a really normal evolutionary process from its beginning to one that is now an existential threat, which is the actual renewal of the Charter. The cycle of renewal was designed to allow evolution, but it was never really supposed to admit the idea of, abolition or dissolution of the BBC, although it technically did. Nobody really thought it should do that. And now we're moving into a period where that's a live political possibility and it's not a theoretical one. What we have proposed is an idea called the public lock. Now, as part of the broader proposals, we've proposed a standing citizens panel that is a counterweight to the board, but this is a different body that would be to defend the existence of the BBC, essentially to allow to ensure that any proposal that is made to fundamentally alter or abolish the BBC, that means its existence, its independence, the principle of universality, should be subject to public consent of a kind, not overriding parliamentary sovereignty, but as a prelude to it. And not just the decision of whichever government happens to hold office when these decisions fall due, right? We're arguing, as many others are, that the BBC is not just a broadcaster, it's critical national infrastructure, it underpins our democratic discourse, it's the only bit of technology infrastructure and our national technology stack that we actually own, and that we haven't invited sort of various foreign owned and foreign directed technology corporations into, aside from all the things that Clive and others have talked about in terms of social cohesion, shared knowledge, and so on. And also because it's free of surveillance and data harvesting and commercial capture, it's particularly valued and cherished and unique. So what would the public lock actually do? So any proposal triggering the threshold, abolition, removal of independence, changes to the public purposes, would require a citizens' assembly. And this would constitute, something like 150 members selected by civic lottery, stratified to reflect the UK population, and they would deliberate. This would be constituted by an independent third-party body that was contracted through a public tender. There are lots of expert bodies that do this sort of work, Sortition Foundation and others. And they would deliberate over a minimum of, let's say, 4 weekends. They'd hear evidence, they'd publish their recommendations on this particular proposal. This would then be tabled before Parliament, but then a second assembly would need to be convened 3 years later, a minimum of 3 years later, to allow a bit of a buffer and sort of to ensure that this wasn't just a political moment. Then a second assembly with discrete members would then do the same thing. And these reports would then again be tabled before Parliament. And the second stage is that, the House of Commons would need to debate this and consider the government's proposal in light of what these two citizens' assemblies have said. And then the other legislatures of the UK, the devolved legislatures, would need to also vote. And the threshold for approving any changes required would be supermajorities. So just as in the 2013 Press Recognition Panel Charter and in the accompanying legislation, you'd need a supermajority of 2/3 in each of these legislatures to pass that. And this is to ensure that Westminster doesn't have primacy in that sense over other parts of the UK, because this is a UK-wide institution and it's one that serves through universality all parts of the UK and all citizens and all residents of the UK. And therefore, there should be representative voting across all of those legislatures because of the sort of existential nature of that service that is proposed to being changed or reduced or taken away. And this finally isn't about making the BBC unreformable, unchangeable, to sort of block parliamentary sovereignty. It's really that ultimately the principle is this is supposed to be a public institution. And for any changes, you need the public's informed consent. At the moment, we don't have that because all of the methods of interaction flow back ultimately to the government. And so having a direct possibility of direct public voice expressing what it feels as a constituted deliberative body provides a clear counterweight to any sort of political or other kind of influence over the BBC's existence. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Samir. That was great. Let's move then to Gareth Bennest to talk about Windows on the World for audiences. Gareth.
Thanks, Lee. Hello, everyone. I'm Gareth from the International Broadcasting Trust. We are a charity that represents around 60 leading humanitarian, international development and environmental NGOs. And we do so in trying to push for a media that tells more and better stories about our world and helps to connect UK audiences with people and places around the world. The BBC is a crucial window onto the world for mass audiences. And without that window and windows like it, it's harder for citizens to understand the world around them. They're less likely to empathise with people beyond our borders. less able to situate political and social challenges within the world that shapes them, and we think less inclined to support actions and campaigns that address global injustices. Now, the BBC is obliged to provide impartial news and information to help people understand and engage with the world around them. They are obliged to ensure audiences can engage with global issues and participate in the democratic process at all levels as active and informed citizens. We are just at in the process of finalising some research that we've been doing with Professor Martin Scott at the University of East Anglia. And unfortunately, the monitoring that we've been doing in January of all of the news broadcasters, including the BBC, has shown a significant decline in international coverage on BBC News at 10, on BBC Today programme, and other outlets. Around 21% we've seen a decline on ITV News and around 12% decline on BBC News at 10. So even though they have an obligation to provide that window through news and current affairs, that rate is declining significantly, and we're very concerned about the decline that we're seeing. They have those obligations and responsibilities, as I say, in news and current affairs, but we feel it can't rest with news and current affairs. It has to be broadened out. Audiences are increasingly disengaging from the news. There is a growing news avoidance and growing distrust in the mainstream media, in the mainstream news. So we feel the BBC's obligation has to go far beyond news and current affairs to encompass all of their genres and programme types. We want to see the BBC opening up the world to everyone through all forms of entertainment. So when Ramesh Ranganathan, the comedian, goes to Rwanda, or when Nadia Hussain goes to Bangladesh, it opens up opportunities for audiences to connect with people, to connect with cultures, to learn about our world, and to understand what's happening at home through our increased awareness of what's happening around the world. Now, in danger of being accused of suggesting that we tinker by Clive, and recognising after my fellow panellists have recommended some really significant structural changes, we are actually proposing some fairly small amendments to the BBC's public purposes that will just shift the emphasis for its international obligations away from just news and current affairs to encompass all genres, all forms of entertainment, to help audiences continue to engage, even those that aren't watching the news, which unfortunately is a growing proportion of the audience. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, Lee. How am I getting on?
You're about on 3 minutes, so if you could just wrap up.
On 3 minutes. Okay, well, I'll wrap up there. I'll steal a couple of seconds also just to raise awareness that one of the other things that we are pushing for in the consultation to the DCMS is to ensure that the BBC opens up and is more transparent and accountable in the way that it's using algorithms, in the way that it is delivering public service media through its online platforms, because unfortunately we currently know nothing about the BBC's algorithms. We know as much about TikTok's algorithms as we do about the BBC recommendation systems. That's another thing we're pushing on, but I don't have time to share that with you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Gareth. But that might certainly be something that we could pick up in the conversation afterwards. So hold that thought, everyone. Thanks very much again. Let's move then to Jack Shelbourne, who's going to talk about the world's first fully sustainably integrated public broadcaster. Jack.
Hi everyone, Jack Shelbourne, University of Lincoln. So the BBC runs on energy. It turns power into culture. Whether that's television, radio, online content or global distribution, the BBC depends on lighting, cameras, studios, transport, servers and digital infrastructure. Production is not abstract, it is material. Yet the Green Paper largely frames the BBC as a governance and funding question. Sustainability appears mainly through BAFTA Albert and carbon reporting. Those tools matter. They have improved carbon literacy across the sector, but reporting alone does not consistently change how production actually happens. Research examining Albert's impact suggests that while carbon accounting raises awareness, it does not reliably transform department-level decisions. It does not automatically reshape lighting strategy, scheduling patterns, unit scale or mobility, especially in fragmented environments like regional news and factual production. Without structural reform, sustainability risks remaining administrative rather than operational, and that is the core issue. The biggest emission levers sit inside craft and workflow, in how shoots are planned, how power is used, how crews move, and how expectations are set. Contemporary production has normalized high energy practices, global mobility, compressed schedules, night shooting, and uniform high intensity lighting. These are cultural norms, they are not environmentally neutral. Climate transition will require recalibrating scale, speed, and aesthetic expectations. This will be uncomfortable. Some long-established production habits may need to change, but preserving existing norms in a carbon-constrained world carries greater long-term risk to institutional credibility and resilience. The opportunity here is strategic. The BBC has historically been one of the UK's strongest sources of soft power. It has shaped global standards in journalism, storytelling, and public service broadcasting. If it becomes the world's first fully sustainable integrated public broadcaster, it can extend that leadership into the defining challenge of this century. That means embedding environmental responsibility at charter level. It means integrating environmental performance into Ofcom oversight. It means reforming commissioning at greenlighting stage. And it means embedding sustainability directly into camera, lighting, and production workflows, where energy demand is actually determined. It also means investing in sustainable production training, so low energy methods become professional norms rather than optional extras. If the BBC does this, it will not only export programmes, it will export standards and production models that would strengthen UK soft power worldwide and position the UK as a leader in sustainable cultural production. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jack. And bang on 3 minutes, so you get double points. Let me turn now to Andrew Smith, who's going to talk about the British Cultural Pass.
Okay, thank you very much. And so you've been listening to some powerful ideas on governance, sustainability and diversity. I agree with many of them. I fundamentally believe that the government should be removed from controlling the BBC's funding, but changing the governance structures won't make a single difference to how the large majority of the British public thinks about the BBC, and it won't fund what it's being asked to do. In under 5 to 10 years, when you turn your TV on, you'll be fed an algorithm. People will not be pressing BBC One. So we need to find a way to fund the BBC, keep British culture alive, and bring the people that are paying for this with us. So I propose that the BBC joins into what I call a British Cultural Wealth Fund. This will sit above the BBC and it will distribute money to the BBC. If you contribute, then you are a member. Members get elected to the board, and government does not set the funding level. Government does not appoint the leadership. It structurally removes political tinkering from public broadcasting. The model is simple. Money comes in and money goes out in 3 ways. I believe the licence fee should be renamed to something called a British Cultural Pass. It becomes a one line on your council tax. I don't say that's perfect, but I think it's fairer. We decriminalise it and most people would pay less. We then add a 4% levy on studios over a certain size and streamers operating into the UK. Netflix, Amazon, Fremantle and BBC Studios would pay this. And global revenues through BBC subscriptions, advertisements, IP returns complete the third income stream. In total, these 3 strands could bring in an extra 700 million to £1 billion a year to British culture. So with the money out, firstly, we guarantee protected funding for the BBC, independent of governance. Secondly, we create a creative pot, a fund of money. Any studio, any regional filmmaker or broadcaster can bid to make a show or film. The BBC is not building this. Other people can use this money. But to get the cash, you must tell a British story. You must employ 60% of the British cast and crew, and the fund retains a permanent share of IP forever. Streaming, licensing, merchandise, all that, a percentage of that money comes back into the Wealth Fund. And finally, we give the members what I call a cultural credit. This could be worth around £15. This is like an Amazon voucher, which the person can spend on a local newspaper, a cinema ticket, a museum. You can even get themselves a GB News subscription if you want, whatever you want. The BBC is not the fund, but it is the central pillar. Over time, I envisage things like the BFI, the Arts Council, maybe Channel 4 could join the Cultural Wealth Fund. This connects everything that people are discussing today. If you want governance from reform, it's mutualised. If you want independence, funding is separate from government. If you want sustainability, we'll make the cultural pot a condition. And if you want diversity, we can make sure that that cultural pot is invested in measurable representation. Instead of dividing a shrinking pot of money, we build a growing national asset. The public is no longer paying for culture, but is owning and participating in it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That was great. Let's move now to Jonathan Hardy, and Jonathan Hardy is going to talk an advertiser-free future for the BBC.
Thanks, Lee. I am indeed. I'm going to speak to the case against the BBC taking advertising. This is one of 4 submissions by members of CPBF North, which is the successor to the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom. The others cover BBC and Ofcom governance and extending the public consultation. The Green Paper floats proposals for the BBC public services to take advertising, either fully across all services or limited to BBC online channels. This is incredibly poorly discussed in the Green Paper. There's no real effort to present an economic case, which is intrinsically very weak, and there's no acknowledgement of the wider implications and detriment. Some important issues are not discussed at all. For instance, there are no ads on BBC Public Services, iPlayer or BBC UK websites at present. Outside the UK, BBC Commercial Services take ads, create branded content, show advertiser-funded programmes. So what are the implications of the BBC carrying advertiser-funded branded content when the current distinctions between the BBC's commercial and public services break down, as they're already starting to do? As many of you know, the BBC is expanding its programming on YouTube that carries no ads, but all its competitors, including all of the commercial public service channels, ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, do run ads. So we're seeing a breakdown happening already. At stake then, in the debate, is not just restricting advertising, but updating restrictions on commercial sponsor influence in a whole variety of forms. Brands would love to draw on the BBC's trust, quality and independence, but in doing so they would weaken and ultimately destroy those values. That's why the discussion in the Green Paper is so poor. It identifies the impacts of advertising as being on the viewer experience and on broadcast competitors, but it will be much greater than that. Advertising would influence programme decisions and content, integrate the BBC into invasive online ad markets, undermine universality, and if relied on as a funding source would threaten the distinctiveness and viability of BBC services. Advertising would bring to the BBC core, as others have mentioned, it would bring it into an ad tech system that requires data capture, surveillance and targeting to function. Alongside subscription, it would undermine universality by superserving the rich and underserving the rest. So key demands. It's vital that we have an ad-free BBC at the centre of our increasingly commercialised media ecology. There should be no advertising on any BBC public services, and we need an updated framework that protects the whole BBC from branded content and the undue influence of advertisers. Sorry, my timer's telling me I've made it. Thank you, Lee.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Appreciate it. Let's move now to David Hutchinson, who will talk about the devolution/federalisation of the BBC. Sorry, you're still muted. Apologies.
That okay now?
Yeah.
Jolly good. Sorry. David Hutchison, Glasgow Caledonian University for most of my career. And I better admit now that I did spend some considerable time on BBC committees, but several decades ago. As we all know, constitutionally, the United Kingdom now operates under what we might call asymmetrical quasi-federalism. It's a terrible phrase, but it does characterise a situation where we've got the significant devolution of powers from Westminster to Edinburgh, to Cardiff, and indeed to Northern Ireland. And of course, the devolution of policy areas is not uniform, so is asymmetrical. There isn't an English Parliament as yet, but of course, Westminster often behaves as if it was an English Parliament when it's dealing, for example, with education and health in England. Now, the interesting thing about broadcasting is it was not devolved. Broadcasting policy was not devolved. But this hasn't prevented the Welsh and Scottish governments and the Northern Ireland executive taking keen interest in what is going on in BBC services and non-BBC services in their nations, and very often doing so in a very critical way. And quasi-federalism is actually reflected in how the BBC now presents its annual reports and accounts. The mechanisms are all specified in the current charter. These reports must be presented not only to the UK Parliament, but also to the other three jurisdictions. And it's also the case now that when the UK government appoints members of the BBC board who represent Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, it has to seek agreement of the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish ministers. And Ofcom, of course, has similar procedures. Alongside these moves, though, there's been a rather startling loss. We used to have BBC audience councils, 4 of them, for the nations of Britain. And before that, we had national broadcasting councils for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. The members of these bodies were appointed by the corporation, but from outside, and were meant to represent audiences and to offer external advice. But they have gone. They went with the last charter. Now, I spent a number of years on the selection panel, which recommended members of the then Broadcasting Council for Scotland to the Board of Governors in London. And of course, it was a kind of internal and external process. Ultimately, the BBC decided who would actually be on these bodies. But the usefulness of having a National Broadcasting Council was obvious to me, because the senior executives seemed to derive useful input and support. And I think that my experience was in Scotland, but I think that was the case also in Wales and Northern Ireland. And looking back on the whole devolution process, it could be argued that the BBC in particular could have got ahead of the game. It could have sought to reinvent itself as a genuinely federated organisation. And I think charter renewal offers the opportunity to now move forward on the genuine devolution, possibly even federalisation of the BBC. And if that were deemed an objective, then the new charter would require, first of all, the re-establishment of 4 audience councils, which would be charged with ensuring that both the managers of the corporation and whatever body replaces the current board are fully conversant with the needs and concerns of audiences in the 4 constituent nations of Britain. Membership of the councils should be broadly representative of audiences, and their chairs should be members of whatever overall governing body is required by the new charter. Now, people are bound to say, this is going to be difficult territory if we're serious about it. How far could you let devolution, federalisation go within the BBC and still have a recognisable BBC? What would the implications be when it came to allocating resources from the licence fee or from whatever might replace it, and or from other sources? And maybe most profoundly of all, how could BBC devolution or federalisation be reconciled with the need for a strong centre able to resist the occasional improper pressure from politicians and others?
Thank you very much, David. Really fascinating ideas. And we're on to the last 2 contributors. I'm going to first ask Anna Shea to speak on behalf of Equity about empowering the creative workforce. Anna.
At Equity, which is the UK's largest creative industries trade union, 2 things have surprised us about this current BBC Charter review. The first is the complete absence from the Green Paper of any reference to any of the trade unions with which the BBC has collective agreements. And the second is the lack of confidence in the BBC that DCMS and the corporation itself seem to demonstrate. And the underlying message, which is sometimes explicit, sometimes unspoken, is that the BBC has failed. And this is demonstrably untrue. As a trainer and employer of talent and a purveyor of unique British storytelling, the BBC is an unparalleled success. The corporation contributes almost 5 billion to the economy annually, supporting over 50,000 workers. And this workforce is wide and varied. It includes not only journalists, but actors, comedians, backstage crew, musicians, and more. And some of these people are employed directly, many others are freelance or commissioned workers. Thousands of equity members rely on these jobs with the BBC to subsidize their work in other, even more precarious sectors like theatre. And we hear a lot about the salary disclosures that the BBC has to make for its highest paid earners, but a lot less about what the average person working for the BBC as freelancer, as an employee, makes. And equity research shows that the average earnings of equity members from the creative industries is £15,270 per year. That's after expenses, but before tax. So in touting the success of the BBC, I don't wish to minimize the ways in which the corporation needs to improve, one of which is the disastrous privatization that has undermined terms and conditions of employment and created a highly inefficient internal market within the BBC. Another major problem is the underinvestment in certain parts of the UK, which some people have already referred to. And I just want to flag particularly the Midlands getting a deeply unfair amount of BBC investment for many decades now. Fundamentally, however, we would say the only real failures are the government's timidity in the face of seismic political and technological change, and the corporation's inability to reimagine itself as a genuinely public institution. And we need to refound this foundational institution of the UK with trade unions recognized as key partners of the BBC in guaranteeing good jobs across the nations and regions. The BBC should be understood as an arm of the welfare state, in which arts and culture are enshrined as an essential public service alongside health, education, social security, and housing. Creative expression is foundational to the human experience, and arts and culture have an intrinsic value as a public good. So I'm not an equity member, so I have no talent as a performer, so I won't sing the final quote I wish to leave you with. I will just say it, the line from the famous song, "It is bread we fight for, but we fight for roses too." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was great. And our very final contributor, although not the final person in the document, of course, but I'd like to invite Jaldeep Katwala to contribute his experience or his ideas about diversity of thought on behalf of the Sir Lenny Henry Centre. Jaldeep.
Hello there. It's been striking that we've had diversity of thought actually in all these presentations, and I think that's the sort of mentality that we need inside the BBC as well. The problem is this, that if people, the population of the United Kingdom, don't see themselves represented on television, and that of course includes underrepresented voices, then the legitimacy of the license fee goes away. And what the BBC is good at is meeting targets on paper, but what about how people progress through the organization? And how about leaders from these underrepresented groups? How are they progressing? How are their careers progressing? And that's the problem. So why does it matter? Well, we need to have a diverse workforce within the BBC because that naturally is going to produce more diverse output. Structural issues are the real problem here as well. Not just targets, we need to drive real change. And without reforming the BBC, diversity is just going to be a set of numbers that we collect rather than transformative. We need the BBC to change for the better. What needs to change then? Well, we need to have transparent data. At the moment, the BBC is collecting lots of data, but this should be even further and better and deeper and richer. We need to see data by regions, by teams, by divisions. We need to also include freelancers and independent suppliers. There needs to be investment for diverse productions and commissioning funds as well. We need to have decentralized commissioning. Senior roles and budgets need to be devolved to the nations and the regions. And the BBC needs to be better at handling the issue of disability in particular, because disabled careers are not progressing in the way that they are and that they should be inside the BBC. And finally, I think there needs to be a board level position, as in the executive management level, who would report directly to the Director General. Somebody who would take on and champion diversity right the way throughout the organization, and to be the voice of diversity within the organization as well. So what is our vision of what the BBC could be if all of these measures are in place? Well, you'd have programs that are led by people from all backgrounds. You'd have audiences across the UK feeling that the BBC is genuinely and really for them. And you'd have a license fee that feels legitimate, because representation is real, it's not just a statistic, a number that we collect. Now, one final thing to say is that I joined the BBC 5 license fee charter renewals ago, rather, and it's greatly changed from what it was before. It needs to improve even more, though. It needs to be better, and it needs to be the best that it can be. There's been great progress, but there's plenty more to do. And our document, our paper, is part of the way to getting there, as all the rest of the papers too.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Jardine. That's a great way to complete the presentations. We're going to open it up to to discussion now, but I'll just remind you, because we've had 10 people speaking, all marvellously keeping to time, that we've covered ideas that ran through the Public Service Cooperative, a Public Media Commission, the Public Lock, Windows on the World for Audiences, the world's first fully sustainably integrated public broadcaster, the British Cultural Pass, an advertiser-free BBC, a devolved and federalised BBC, empowering the creative workforce, and diversity of thought properly embedded and going beyond numbers and tick boxes. There is, of course, a lot more in the Green Paper, and the other authors are also here in the audience, I think, or at least a lot of them are. So, in fact, the only people we don't have are the Public Interest News Foundation. So unfortunately, they're not here to answer questions, although we can pass questions on. So please, if you have also questions about the other aspects of the Green Paper, please do raise them as well. Because it's the Zoom meeting, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for those great presentations. Because there are a lot of us, your faces to me are spread over 4 screens. So if you would like to ask a question, if you could raise your electronic hand, you will then pop to the front of my page, and then I'll be able to see who you are, and then we will unmute you. We're going to keep everyone on mute just for the kind of clarity of the discussion, unless you're speaking, and I hope that's okay with everyone. So, are there any questions, any thoughts, any reflections? I've seen a couple of things in the chat. Please do feel free to keep adding to the chat if you would like to. Presenters can also ask questions as well, of course. Diane, I think you're muted still. There you go.
Yeah. Hello. It's to pick up on some of the points in the chat bar and to ask, because there's about 90 people, I think, as you said, Lee, on this call.
Yeah.
Do people feel there's an appetite for coming to some public debates, some regional events, to raise, that sense of, is there enough interest in all of this, for example? So I'd just be interested in gauging, just from this group, whether there would be enough interest in that. If there are, I'm fairly certain between us all we could manage something. But how do we move it on? And maybe it's about getting people out and raising voices.
I mean, I think I'll just kind of briefly respond to that and then let other people jump in. We would love to circulate the document more widely. It's currently on the Media Reform Coalition website, and we're still inviting contributions or welcoming contributions. But of course, every contribution has questions for the public to respond to. And the document itself has been very, developed in an incredibly tight time frame. And so at the moment, there's still an awful lot more to do, and that public outreach is a really key part of it. And Carol, I think it might be you who put in the chat about young people and involving young people more as well. And I know the Hard Art Collective is organising a citizens' assembly with young people later in the year, but certainly, broadening the audience to a much more diverse, much more diverse audience for the document and for responses to the document is really important for us. So any ideas about how to do that are very welcome, and we would absolutely support any regional outreach, even down to the very local level. This is about democracy, really. Carol.
Thank you so much for wonderful work, all of those who've contributed. And it was a joy to listen to you all and be stimulated to think in ways perhaps one hadn't thought about. As an ex-politician, thinking about the time that politicians have, their attention span, are we going to give any thought to how, under possibly 3 headings, anchoring the BBC constitutionally, that's a permanence of the charter maybe, so it can't be undermined or removed by a hostile government, all those wonderful ideas around democracy and cultural rights. Then number 2, independence of governance, no government interference, the idea of something akin to the German KEF from the VLV. And then there are all the questions around funding and household levy as opposed to a licence fee, more progressive. I feel I've got a 1-pager or a 2-pager coming on. I'm thinking aloud because I just know that you need a leave behind. We need to see as many people as we possibly can, both civil servants, BBC types, and those politicians. And they need to be able to grasp very quickly that there's 3 or 4 dimensions to this with these kinds of ideas, and that maybe can lodge in their minds rather than something too complicated for them. That was just my thought to begin with, but it doesn't diminish. I'm not seeking to diminish anybody's ideas. I'm thrilled by all the ideas I've heard this evening.
Tom, Carol mentioned the household levy. Would you like to just have a brief mention of that, because that's the proposal that you've put in the AGP?
I will try my best, although I do have a small toddler running around the room behind me. So if there's screams in the middle, it's not opposition to the proposal. It is just a small child. Yes, in the paper I've written about a universal or public media levy as a way to replace the licence fee. I think many in this conversation have spoken about the dangerous and perilous financial situation the BBC is in, not least from the failures of the licence fee as a funding model. Yes, that's right. And I propose that if we have a universal household levy that's paid by all households, it would help to restore the BBC's mission as a universal broadcaster, potentially by lowering the overall cost for everybody, and particularly by unlinking the BBC from this idea that it is funded because you watch a particular kind of service or you use a particular kind of media device. Obviously, the question around can you get everybody to support that is very difficult. I think what it requires really is a major national conversation about why the BBC and universal media is important. Politicians have shied away from this for too long. I think they have cowered from basically having a conversation about why does public media exist? Why is the notion of collective national investment in anything important, and why collective national investment in media is important? I think that's partly where the submission on the public media levy has gone, and certainly the questions at the end about how would we make this work? How would you ensure that it brings all of the public together? It would need serious governance and institutional reforms in the BBC as well. I don't think any changes to the BBC's funding model will ever take place unless there is a real significant change in how the BBC operates as a public institution. But just as a starter for somewhere where some kind of desperately needed alternative to the licence fee is what I've tried to offer in that piece. And thank you for enduring my toddler noises in the background.
I mean, I think the other funding there are a number of different funding ideas. We've got the Cultural Pass that Andrew talked about, and the Media Freedom Fund, which is from the Independent Media Association. I don't know if Tom Barlow is here as well. He might want to comment on that. And also, of course, the independence threads through as a really strong argument across the section on governance and the way that the BBC should be, held really fully apart from political influence. There is an allusion to, I mean, the interesting, thing about the Green Paper is that some of these issues, they're kind of like waved at, but nothing really substantial is put forward to create significant change. They're waved at, and then there's a bit of tinkering, should we just elect the chair, etc., for independence. And I think that's the worrying thing. The waving and the stepping back from anything significant suggests that albeit supportive of the BBC, the Green Paper doesn't really change much for the BBC. And yet, as Clive said at the beginning, this is a really crucial moment where the BBC needs us, but we also need the BBC to be the best that it can be. And so those issues of constitutionality, security, independence, and funding that we see as legitimate, that is not constantly contested, are all really important. Tracy.
Hi, yeah, I was just sort of kind of referring to a question that's kind of a combination of how do you get younger people involved, how do we get the MPs interested, blah blah blah, and it's like the BBC now have got a kind of advert about the BBC saying it's made of here, and but when you drill down, those things aren't really made of here. And I'm picking up on Anna Shea, like it has to be the workers, the workers who be they're freelance or directly employed, who are actually making content are the BBC. But it's like I keep saying, our stories have to come from all the regions and nations, and whether that's dramatic stories, comedy stories, news stories, they're our UK stories. And there's a massive there should be a massive collective pride in that. So like our alternative green paper, and there's just loads of fantastic ideas. Obviously, I'm an actor. The one I most love is the one from Equity. And that's so it's like to make a video, to make it exciting that we have an alternative green paper, and it's like drilling those down into like there's this idea, but it's like your BBC owned by you have a say in it, and it's to make our UK stories. Why do we keep giving everything away to America? Why do we let America own everything? We have our diverse and interesting culture, and we have to make like made of here, but really made of here because we're going to make it our BBC. That was just kind of ideas whipping around my head.
I think that sounds like a 2-pager, Tracy. So you may have to submit. But yes, no, absolutely agree. Becoming much more forensic about what's actually ours and what isn't is really important, I think. Samir.
So I had a couple of thoughts just to add. One on the independence question. We, as part of the Demos report, one of the things that we had to sort of work through was because we looked at the landscape of different proposals that there have been, and that, going quite a few charter renewals back into the discussions in Hansard and all sorts of different sources that, colleagues on this will have been much more both involved in and aware of. In a sense, we try to take a step back and look at the system of governance as it is right now. How does that, in a sense, if you, given the short time window, given the political realities of where we are, what is the space that needs to be created in order that more radical reforms might come down the line? So in a sense, some of the reforms that that we've put forward, I think are, if you like, they're not hugely radical each in and of themselves, but if you look at the different kinds of reforms that are proposed, they interact together to create a sort of defensible space within which then creative and editorial freedom for the BBC is there. And also one of the things that we've proposed is that they're written into the charter is a sort of a requirement for the BBC to involve citizens, but without prescribing exactly what that mechanism is in order to allow it to evolve over time. I think that, in a sense, the desire to want to fix things in order to reduce wiggle room is one thing, but I think layering that, seemed to be to us the most sort of pragmatic way of getting a principle embedded, but then permitting things to be changed over time. So I think in a way that's one of the challenges I would push back to colleagues, which is there's a huge spectrum of ideas, and of course there's an incredible amount of creativity, but I, as a sort of relative neophyte in some ways compared to the battles that many of you have sort of fought through, I'm curious to know from all of you what you think the political realities of this are and what the political trade-offs are, because one of the things that we've been told is, the government has, if you like, one or two, it has space for like one or two big things. It'll be governance and funding, or it'll be funding and participation. So I'm curious about that and where people are on that. The second thing I wanted to say was very short, which is to do with adopting frameworks that already exist in the rest of the UK or in other parts of the UK. So there are two in particular I'd pick out that we've advocated should be integrated. One is the Future Generations Act in Wales, which I think then opens the door to some of the youth involvement and participation and shifts the sort of balance of the burden of responsibility in a way towards future generations, both from the government and from the BBC itself. And then the second one is a newer one, which I'm less familiar with in detail, but I think also, maybe speaks to what some of the colleagues have talked about, is the community wealth building requirement in Scotland. So I'm curious about whether those offer frameworks that are ready-made that could easily be applied within the context of the BBC, given what it does, but then give us a sort of a runway to evolve over time and to progressively ratchet our way towards more participatory, just, etc. ways of doing this.
Thanks, Amir. And I know we've got three more people. I just want to say in relation to that it's a really important point, I think, not least because we cannot underestimate how unused people are, people in power, government and indeed BBC executives, to involving the public and engaging the public beyond a source of information or a response to the quality of a program, etc. This idea of sharing power as in governance structures, I think very often is very scary, and institutions all across the world are like that when you suggest that the public should become more involved. So that idea of progressing change is clearly key. But as you say, we need some kind of a starting point that shifts the world in that direction, because at the moment there is really nothing much for us to hold on to. So it's a really key foundational point. Tom, over to you, Tom Mills.
Hi everyone, thanks for the really interesting contributions and discussion. It's just a quick question. It's mainly for David on devolution, but also picks up on something that Tracy's touched on just now and Jack in the comments. I know, David, your focus is much more on accountability to the devolved administration, so it's kind of a governance focus. I suppose one question I'd have there is would the vision be that the BBC is making, say, for example, programs in Scotland for Scotland? Because I think one of the potential pitfalls with a devolution of program making, well, not program making, but program distribution, is that people in England then don't know what's going on in other parts of the UK. So I've always felt that a good way of doing this is being able to say, well, we have a UK-wide platform, and then we all learn from each other's stories, and that sort of disrupt some of the England, south of England, and particularly London focus on the BBC. So just a question of what you thought about that.
That's me unmuted. Yeah, I mean, I think you raised an interesting question there, and the same thing could be said in Wales. I noticed actually that a committee of the Senedd was complaining recently, actually, about there not being enough programmes made about Wales, for Wales, and for beyond. I mean, I entirely accept your point that if you federalise to the extent that one might want, we could end up not knowing much about each other. Now, I think it's fair to say that at the moment, if you look at discussion in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, you will find that the 10 o'clock news and BBC One comes in for a lot of criticism in not representing enough what is going on elsewhere in Britain. And I think that's a legitimate area for discussion. And I would not advocate a federal system which actually meant we didn't know what was going on elsewhere in Britain. To be honest with you, the BBC in Scotland, they managed to persuade Tony Hall to allow them to have a new channel separate from BBC One and BBC Two. Not been a great success. And they ran a news programme which went on for an hour at 9 o'clock, which wasn't the smartest idea. But I remember noticing how little, if you watch that programme, we were learning about what was going on in the other parts of the United Kingdom. And I had the opportunity to put that point to the then controller, who conceded it. So that is, you're right. There's a genuine problem there that we become isolated from each other's nation, and that would not be a good thing, either in news, current affairs, or maybe more equally importantly, in drama. I think that's absolutely important.
Thanks, David. Greg.
Hello, everyone. I represent the Children's Media Foundation, so I'm very interested to see all the references to young people in the chat. We are not participators in your project. We haven't contributed, and we're still working on our submission to the BBC. But it will take a position that is slightly different from almost everyone who has spoken and what's in the Green Paper, and that is that the BBC has substantially lost the younger audience under 16. So all the conversations, for example, about having discussions in universities, I would be very interested to discover how many university students actually know what the BBC is, apart from the fact that they'll have all received their letters telling them they have to pay their license fee, which they don't understand. And the neurodiverse are climbing the walls because they're being told they're going to prison, and so on and so on. BBC's relationship with young people is in an abysmal state, apart from CBeebies. So our proposal will follow up on a lot of the ideas that's expressed in the alternative Green Paper. We will talk about some forms of democratization. We will talk about new ways of gathering the license fee. In particular, one way that we're experimenting with is the idea of the broadband levy, which is not dissimilar to the household tax and could be made to be quite progressive rather than regressive. We're going to suggest that whatever you do, you need to get rid of the license fee, because that will at least get rid of the collection costs. If you get rid of the collection costs, it actually produces the amount of money we feel is needed to upgrade the children's propositions and also free the BBC up to make partnerships that allow it to become a technical innovator again. And something that was noticed in the Public Service Media Alliance recently, the Public Service Media Forum, sorry, Pip, that one of the purposes of the BBC, it was previously allowed in 2007 to involve itself in technological innovation. In 2017, it was told it could not do that anymore. And the BBC has become hidebound by public interest tests, the market tests, and so on. Our proposal is going to be that the BBC completely change its purposes. It actually changes the verbs in the purposes. It no longer becomes a deliverer of content. It becomes, if you like, and we wish we could find a better word, the concierge of the nation's culture and its community. So BBC becomes building better community. And it starts by doing that with kids, by bringing the kids back, especially in a scenario where the government are talking about banning social media to the under 16s. If you ban social media to the under 16s, where do they go? Well, maybe at a stretch, and my God, it'll take some doing, we bring them back to the BBC by making it a safe place, a fun place, a place they can communicate with each other, a place that stimulates their own creativity and allows them to post it, and sets them on the road for a social and community life with a national community organisation. That presupposes things like more democratization. It actually allows greater democratization because as that progresses over the next 10, 20, and 30 years, and entire generations of people live their community through the BBC, then the BBC can harvest their data. It can be the one that actually understands what the national conversations are. That changes the relationships of the governors to the organisation. They now become not individual experts, but interpreters of the insights that they learn from the national conversations that are taking place inside and around the BBC. And the BBC equally can partner out, and it would need to partner out with organisations like Tim Berners-Lee's organisation, Mozilla, and others who are into a more federal, community-based internet. Tim Berners-Lee believes the future of social media is not commercial, but community-based. He rather probably mistakenly believes that current behemoths will die or be constricted. It's just an interesting opportunity. We don't believe for 1 second that anyone's going to pick up on it, but we're going to propose that the BBC becomes about building better community and becomes the concierge of the nation's culture and the nation's conversations.
Fantastic, Greg. That's really interesting. I think we would all really love to read that. It reminds me to ask people if they would like to share their proposals via the Media Reform Coalition. We would love to see them as well, or their submissions rather. But it does once again underline this need for rethinking and kind of disconnection perhaps from the history to try and work out what the future might be without being tied to an organisation that, as Dan said at the very beginning, is 100 years has been 100 years in the making. That's an awful lot of history to disconnect from, and we don't need to get rid of it all, but we do need to move on from it in some ways as well. And I think your ideas speak to that. Dan.
So just picking up from what Greg just said, I mean, the state suppression of public innovation at the BBC actually goes back a long way. And in the 90s, BBC staff were trying to develop community-based digital social media, and they were prevented from doing so on the grounds that it would inhibit market innovation. And so as a result, we've got these extractive data vampires based in California instead of a public option in digital media. So I'm wholly in agreement with you there about the need for sort of public sector innovation, and the BBC is the obvious vehicle for it. I wanted to sort of talk to Samir's point about the nature of the reforming agenda that we put on the table now. I think it's important we understand just how fluid our politics are now. It may well be the case that we have a new culture secretary this year. We're very likely to have a new prime minister this year, and we might have a Labour administration which is in a hurry to do things. And if we present a new model for the BBC, which is inspiring to broad publics, right, that people can see will make a difference to their lives really quite quickly, okay, instead of planting seeds for oaks that will grow over decades and centuries, if we say this is a project that will win you support in the here and now, because it will lead to an effective democratization of our social life, of our news gathering, of our understanding of each other and the world, I think, frankly, the radical option now is the sensible, safe option. I think that incrementalism at this point isn't going to cut it, because people in a hurry, they want to see change and they want to see it now.
Ian, I'll hand to you. We'll make this the last comment. Thanks for that, Dan. And because we're just coming up to 6:30, but Ian, if you'd like to chat.
Thank you. Yes, very interesting to listen to everyone this evening. Good to see such a turnout on an issue which I think is flying under the radar. No one in the mainstream seems to be talking about the Charter Review at all. I'm from the BBC Written Archive Centre campaign. That's distinct to the BBC Written Archive Centre. That is we think an important part of the BBC. It's a very popular part of the BBC with academics, as many of you will know. And if you're not aware of our campaign, essentially, they have restricted access over the last year or two without consultation, and have reduced the ability of people to access the papers of the BBC, which, to Greg's point, I hope, is quite valuable in education terms. It's quite valuable in terms of public understanding of what the BBC has done and what it has achieved over the years, but also just as a repository of unique and valuable material about almost anyone significant who has ever lived in the last century. And we have been battling with them. And the reason I wanted to contribute was because there was a mention just now by Greg of the public purposes. And it concerns us that the consultation document from government barely mentions the second one at all, which is about education for learning of all ages. It is getting forgotten. We also think the BBC is exploiting some weak language in the framework agreement around the archives, which allows them to reduce access because it doesn't really require them to give any in the first place. Audio and video are treated differently. Written is, I think, the vulnerable sibling. So I just wanted to say hello. If Greg wants to get in touch with me, he's very welcome to, if that's useful, because obviously many in the academic community work with schools on projects and so on, which involve that history. And that is all under threat, I'm afraid. And they're getting away with it, simply put. So we will publish our response next week. Lee has a copy of it in draft form, but it will be published next week, and you'll all be able to see it then. But yeah, thanks for this evening.
Great. And if you'd like to just put any contact details in the chat, that would be great. I'm just going to draw in Patrick for one last brief comment because he's been raising his hand and I have missed it. Patrick.
Yeah, one thing I picked up is making the charter so that it can be tamper-proof, because in 3 years' time, it is possible we will have an extreme right-wing government who, just like Trump, will be gunning to destroy the BBC. So I think we need some sort of permanence built into it, and that's probably more important than it ever was. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. Really important point and a great one to end on, actually, in terms of getting rid of this constant and relative uncertainty that hounds the BBC every 10 years. I'd just like to close then by thanking everyone. Thank you so much for your enthusiasm, for your participation, for staying until 6:30, which I know eats into your evening. We really appreciate you taking the time to attend, and we hope that you'll circulate and respond to the AGP over the coming few weeks. If you would like to submit something, please do. Just email us. If you look on the Media Reform Coalition website, there's links there in the document about how to make a proposal. We really don't want the AGP to end up gathering virtual dust on a virtual shelf in our website. So please do help us make sure it's a document that continues to grow. I think there were some really important questions that were raised at the end. What's the space that needs to be created so that more radical reforms are possible? Where do we find that space? But also technology in the BBC, there's a great tendency towards amnesia, and an awful lot of good thinking has been part of the BBC's history, has been part of the media reform movement's history for so many years, and bringing some of that back in, reminding people that it's still here, that it's still about creating the kind of world where we can see arts and culture, as Anna said, as fundamental to our collective lives, as part of our collective welfare, I think is really important. So if we take that inspiration forward and all the inspiration from all the comments that we made tonight, I think that can only be a positive thing. The Charter Review consultation formally is open for another week. There is an email if you don't want to respond to the survey, and if you want to respond in a kind of a more narrative way, and we can circulate that to people who attended as well afterwards. We'll check in the comments afterwards for any comments that are outstanding, and we'll come back to people. We don't have a separate group for this group of people. We haven't got consent for that at the moment, so I don't know whether we can set that up. But if people want to get back in touch with us, there's always the hub of the Media Reform Coalition to work through. And I know Jaldeep has been inviting people to contact him about other events and connections across the regions as well. So thank you once again for coming. It's been great to have you, and thank you for listening, and thank you to all our presenters, and obviously particularly to Clive Lewis for supporting us.